Good morning, everyone. We'll try and get started as close to on time here. Give people a few extra minutes to find the room that they were looking for. So welcome, everyone. My name is Philip Germain. I'm the Vice President of Prevention and Employer Services for the Saskatchewan Workers' Compensation Board, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker. This session is about the key elements of violence prevention. Before I introduce the speaker for this session, there's just a quick reminder that at the end of the session, if you could remember to fill out the session evaluation, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you have questions, because it's such a small room, we won't have mics, but if you could just stand up and try and be kind of loud and proud when you ask your question, that would be great. So our speaker for this session is Mr. Glenn French. Glenn is the President and CEO of the Canadian Initiative on Workplace Violence. Within the mental health field, Glenn has held many senior administrative and clinical positions within both the private and public sectors. Established in 1998, the Canadian Initiative is a consultancy that studies trends in workplace conduct within Canada. They also research and catalog the practices that organizations and unions are using to reduce risk of workplace aggression. The Canadian Initiative is committed to the sharing of this important information. The Canadian Initiative partnered with the federal government in planning the first North American Conference on Workplace Violence. Glenn was invited to address the 9th Annual Global Conference on Occupational Health and Safety in Merida, Mexico, where he tabled his most recent paper entitled Towards a Global Standard for Workplace Conduct. He has also been an invited speaker for such organizations as the American Federation of Labor, Osgoode Law School, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission, to name but a few. So please join me in a hearty, warm welcome to Mr. Glenn French.
Thank you all very much. Just make sure my mic's, everyone hear me now in the back? Perfect. Let me apologize up front. I'm from Toronto, and I realize that when you come anywhere outside of Toronto, when you're out west, you're the guy from out east. When you're the person in Quebec, you're the person who doesn't speak French. And then when I'm out east, I'm the guy from central Canada. So I just apologize up front, so I just get it out of the way now. Now, we've got 2 hours together, and we have a heck of a lot of information to go over in 2 hours. And you'll see right away that we won't get to the end. And you will have questions as we go through this. And I would ask you to stop me at any particular point if you don't understand what I'm saying or you want more information on it. And I'll try to pause to do it that way. The other thing is I'm going to be pointing out a lot of resources that you have access to that you may not know about. And we can distribute that. I have not a problem doing that at all. So before we begin, just take this down. This is not a solicitation, because I know at the end of this presentation I am going to be moving along so quickly I'm going to forget to give this to you. I will be pointing out pieces of information that you can, that are in the public domain that you can get, and if you need direction on where to get them or you need copies, please ask me, because we're all in this together. And the only way that we will be able to sort of master this issue is if we start sharing information with one another. I can assure you that no insurance salesman will call. You're not going to be on a mailing list, and this is not a solicitation. Okay? I just want to make sure you have that. Now, let me say this up front. No one is an expert on this topic. Not I, not you, because this is moving so quickly, the whole issue of violence and aggressiveness and dangerousness at work, that it is becoming problematic. Legislation's moving faster than our ability to truly understand what we're legislating. Now, the organizers of the conference have asked me to cover two big areas. The first part is to look at what a comprehensive violence prevention program would look like in any organization, regardless of this jurisdiction in which you're in. So I'm going to do that. The second part is they would like me also to attend to some specifics with respects to employees and what employees should be concerned about with respects to conduct. And so I'm going to move from the very broad, and I'm going to go down to the specific in terms of threat assessment. What do you look for? What are the ingredients, the anatomy behind a violent event? And so I'll be moving in that direction. And again, ask me any questions that you may have going forward. Now, here's what I want to do for the time that we've got together. And it's a relatively short period of time, and you'll see it's going to go really fast. I should also mention, we will not be having volunteers. I will not have you role play, so you can sit back and relax, doze off if you really need to, but please make sure the evaluation's filled at the end. So here's what we're going to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here, the evolution of workplace violence, because there is a trajectory to this in Canada. And I want to talk a little bit about that. If we understand the context in which we're looking at this phenomena, this occupational safety risk, then we can maybe understand where things are going legislatively. I also want to talk about, of course, as the main issue, is talk about what are the core ingredients of a prevention program. And when I'm going through that, I would ask you to look at or think about your organizations. What do you have in place? Some of these you have in place, without a doubt. Others you may not. And the reason we're putting it together in a sort of cohesive kind of sort of package is so that if you're ever visited by anyone from the ministry and they ask to see your prevention program, you can then articulate what it is. So I'll be talking about that. I want to look at the anatomy of what violence is, because now we're starting to be concerned, and people ask this question all the time, are we any more aggressive or violent or dangerous now than we were 5 or 10 or 15 years ago? The harsh reality is, I don't know. It may appear to be when we see things in the paper every single day around sexual harassment, around the shooting that happened in Maryland this morning. Some of you have picked up the news, the tragedies that are happening across the country. It appears that there's more of it. However, I would ask you this, that we're in a rights era. Everyone has rights. There's more legislation now than there ever has been around conduct, and so people will exercise their rights. It's not as if there's more of it, because my belief is we don't have people with Uzis in every street corner. We don't have predators in every workplace. They've been there 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but we haven't identified it as such. And so we don't know. In fact, fatalities in the workplace when it comes to violence have actually gone down, not gone up. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But what's the anatomy? What is a violent incident? What goes through the perpetrator's mind to the extent that we can understand it? And what can victims do? And I want to also sort of talk about a particular tool that you have access to. You may have seen, because you've enrolled in this particular session, it's a PPC, the Perceived Control sort of guide or screening tool. And I'm hoping that everyone had an access to it online. If you haven't, please let me know. I'll give you a copy. It is a very simple tool that can be used not to predict violence, but to be able to sort of know if you're in the presence of someone that you should refer on to somebody else. So I'll be looking at that very specifically. So these are all the things that I want to talk about. But let's do it this way. Let's start off, and I'm going to try to give you as many examples as I possibly can to make my point. And please, ask me questions. Now, what about this? This is a cartoon that someone wrote that was on a person's desk. The person's desk where this was having some performance issues. There was some concern that he may be fired, and there was some concern that he was fairly aggressive. Now, apart from being a bad pitcher, and if you were Freudian, the size of the gun would make you want to talk about it. But would you be concerned about that? How many people would be concerned if they saw that on somebody's desk who is having some problems? Just you know, okay. Yeah, maybe. It seems a little intimidating. Now, what if I said this to you? What if I said, these names are his bosses, two of his bosses? Would that then make it even worse? So these are the kinds of things that are coming up every single day in every workplace. Is this person going to be violent or not? Is it? And we don't know. And you know what happens is that you hear after an incident, you know, all the signs were there. We should have known the signs. We could have seen them. We could have predicted it. But you know, we don't. We're great at hindsight. We're very poor at being able to predict anything. In fact, when you see those instances that happen periodically when there's maybe a murder-suicide in a family, in a community, what happens is they bring out the press. And then the press, what they do is they bring out the neighbors. Have you ever noticed that? And what do the neighbors say? Neighbors always say, oh, they were quiet. They kept to themselves. They looked like reasonable people. And then they bring out the experts, and the experts say, well, we should have seen that coming. Well, it's very hard to see it coming. And very few of these situations do we see coming. And then what do you do with it is the most important thing. So this particular individual was not violent. He was subsequently fired, but he had not been violent, and there was no history of it. But, you know, we need to look at more information than just simply a cartoon, but the cartoon can make us sit up and think. And so that's where the PPC, the control screening tool that you all have access to, may help you going forward, to ask more questions and to be a little bit more sort of inquisitive about what's happening to that individual. So let's start from the very beginning. This is how legislation evolves in Canada, and any other jurisdiction for that matter. You can look at the European Union, you can look at Australia, you can look at the United States, and the way it works is this way. An incident happens in a workplace which is so egregious, it gets into the press. It could be a fatality. It could be a case of horrendous abuse from one person to another, sexual harassment or bullying or whatever you should call it. It gets to the press, and then the press put it out. And what happens then is that there's what I would refer to as moral outrage. Everyone looks at this and says, my God, how could that possibly happen? And then what happens is legislators legislate. They may do it quickly because they have a whole bunch of constituents who are now upset, and they've got to do something about it. But what happens sometimes is legislators don't legislate in a very intelligent way. I don't know if you've noticed. Sometimes it can be a knee-jerk reaction. So let me give you an example. The OC Transpo shooting that you remember way back in April of 1999, where Pierre Lebrun went into the maintenance shed of the OC Transpo, which is the bus company, where he used to work, and shot 3 people and then shot himself. And you know, what happened shortly after that was an incident happened, it got in the press, there was legislation at the federal level. There was actually a private member's bill that actually got sort of first reading, because everything gets first reading. And this shows you how reactive sometimes legislators can be. So the private member's bill was to suggest that anyone who left their place of employment, whether you got, you retired, you may have quit, you may have got fired, but you left, you have to be psychologically assessed on the way out so that we can be assured that you're not going to come back and harm us. Now think about how idiotic that is. Just think about how moronic that is. You're invading your privacy. It would never get beyond first reading, nor did it. But that gives you an idea of what happens. An incident, press, moral outrage, and that's what you get. Think of the incidences that have happened. I'm thinking now in Ontario, which is Jian Ghomeshi, remember with the CBC. Maybe many of you who have listened to Q. Well, after he did his thing, and we had been involved with the CBC at that time, what happened was that all of a sudden the Ontario government then started to tighten their sexual harassment policies and procedures. Not that it's wrong, but the point is that the legislation on this is not just an occupational health and safety issue, and it is, especially in some sectors, but it's also an emotional and political issue. And so we have to keep that in mind at the same time. Now let me give you some examples of how this works. Here's the moral outrage, the big ticket people who gave us a lot of our legislation. Up the very top there, Pierre Lebrun, who we'll revisit in a few moments. He's the OC Transpo shooter. He did kill himself, and we'll talk more about him. That case has been analyzed over and over and over and over again, and you can still get the inquest results online if you wanted to do that. James Kirkpatrick, it looks like a guy you'd want to go on vacation with. He looks like a nice guy. Actually looks like my neighbor. His wife was dying of cancer, stage 4, and he felt that his employer in Vancouver had not been sympathetic enough to him to give him time off and the like. And then what happened is he came back at a Christmas party after he had been fired and ended up shooting people at the Christmas party. And there was a fatality or 2 there. Viscount, down here in the below left, you may remember that name from Concordia University. He was a professor, and he was beginning very concerned that somehow other people were going to get tenure and he wouldn't. So he decided to eliminate the competition and ended up shooting some people. It didn't work for him. He's still in jail. And every year he petitions to get out, every single year. And also we have Dr. Daniel down here in the middle, and we may remember him. Dr. Daniel was the murderer of a woman named Laurie DuPont, who was a nurse, who worked at Hotel Dieu Hospital in Ontario in Windsor. They had a relationship, and we'll talk more about them in a minute, but they had a relationship and then it broke up. He had clearly had some psychiatric issues. The employer took him off on medical leave and then brought him back without telling her and put them on the same shift at the same time. And what happened was he killed her and then subsequently killed himself. Nanaimo shooter at the top, who remember got laid off. Remember, there's some parallels here that we'll come back and visit in a minute. And of course, the Brinks robbery, or the truck where they were unloading cash, and one individual wanted to take the rest of it. It was a crime of opportunity. He ended up killing several people. At the Canadian Initiative, what we do most of the time is assess the risk associated with a particular individual who has said something, who's done something, who looks a little sketchy. Your spider sense just goes at it. You're just not sure. I don't see anyone in the room like that here, so I think we're all safe for the moment. But so we have an opportunity to be able to look at these things, and I want to give you as many examples as I possibly can. And you'll see right away, no one's an expert here. No one can predict the future. In the absence of a direct threat, we just don't know. But we have a calculated way of making an opinion, which we'll talk to you about in a second. So these were all the things. So there was an evolving conversation in Canada with result to all these incidents that happened is violence. The term violence is all of a sudden being used in a different way. It's no longer just a physical assault on somebody. It can be a psychological harm at the same time. Because you can see in legislation, and I'll look at your legislation in a second, it talks about the word injury. Now, injury can be physical, it can be psychological at the same time. But the argument in Canada from the late 90s right through until very recently, well, you may know that the federal government were one of the first ones to put in place in Part 2 of the Canada Labour Code protections against violence. And put in there was these wonderfully sort of progressive lines that said, an employer must take prescribed steps to protect employees from workplace violence. Now that sounds great, except it took them 7 years to figure out what was workplace violence and what were those prescribed steps. You see, what happens is that we can get legislation, but employers don't necessarily know. It's not prescriptive, so employers don't know what exactly they should do. That's the problem. So if you're a little gray in the little gray area there, and you're not quite sure, you're in good company with the rest of us. But the argument in the very beginning was this: is violence a physical act, or is it a psychological act? That debate went on over and over and over again for years. The second big issue that came up was, who's the perpetrator? Is the perpetrator someone from outside the workplace or someone inside the workplace? And that argument went back. There are some people who said, no, workplace violence has to be someone from outside your workplace coming in. It can't be from someone worker to worker. And a lot of trade unions at that time were very concerned that this would be seen as a worker problem. And of course it's not. You and I know this is the kind of behavior you see in the boardroom right down to the shop floor. It may look different, but it's there. So these two debates went on for years before they could figure out what the regulations were for the federal bill. And finally, if you look across the country, you will start to see things start to sort of meld together. So violence is seen as being a physical and non-physical event, largely in Canada, and it can come from any particular source. Inside the company, outside the company, from someone who's associated with the company to someone who's just a customer to a domestic dispute that's gone very, very bad. It's all of those things. And it's going to start to morph even more. So we're in the middle of it. I just turned 70. And I wish I had another 70 years that I could sort of still study this issue. Because only now is it becoming really, really interesting. And I would hope that some of you, after this particular short session, will go out of here and be students of this issue as well. Because it is truly an issue that we're really starting to wrestle with. So violence now, let's not think of it as just a physical act, a punch, a slap, a kick. It is a psychological act at the same time. And in fact, I would argue that people who have been physically assaulted at work quite often have an easier time moving on than people who are psychologically harmed over a long period of time. And the reason for that is that people who are psychologically harmed over a long period of time, it's character changing. For years, someone told you you're an idiot, you're no good, you're bad at your job, you're stupid, all these things, that changes you. But to have a random act of violence, you can see that as a random act, and it has nothing to do with you. So we have a lot to learn in terms of how this all plays itself out. The question that comes up all the time, are we any more aggressive than we are in the United States? Are we becoming like the United States? We're not. The third leading cause of occupational death in the United States is homicide. We see this every day when you pick up the paper. If you're a woman working in Florida, and I would encourage no woman to work in Florida, the second leading cause of occupational death for women in Florida is gunshot. Now, it doesn't happen in Canada. We don't have people like that here. However, I like to think that we do it the Canadian way. What we'll do, we won't shoot you because of our laws and our culture and the way we are, except what we'll do is we'll make your life a living hell by smiling at you and harassing you. So the face of violence here is very different than it is in the United States. However, we shouldn't be smug about that, because we do know that perpetrators who get to that rare point where they actually harm somebody, have had years, if not months, of abuse. They feel that they've been abused over time. So psychological harm and harassment still is a major issue. It may not always be the perpetrator or the precipitant of a violent act, however, it's there. So Canada ranks 4th in the world when it comes to aggressiveness on the job, according to the International Labour Organization. 4th in the world. And the United States is behind us. The reason for that is you've got to look at all the research because they have identified violence as being just a psychological and a physical act. And so Canadians tend to be a lot more aggressive when it comes to harassment. It seems, anyways, in the data. So there's this evolving conversation, which I think we're now starting to get to the end, and we're starting to see that it is a phenomena that is physical and non-physical. Now, when we get to the moral outrage issue, and here's some examples just to make my point. This is Pierre Lebrun. Now, we knew Pierre Lebrun, we knew he had a history of depression. We knew that he had a speech impediment. He stuttered. And he was the brunt of terrible ridicule on the part of his coworkers. It's sad. You know, most of us like to think we've come a long way from the sandbox, but unfortunately sometimes we haven't. And so he was ridiculed over a course of years. And he went to HR and he went to management and he tried to get some redress on this. And for whatever reason, it never worked out for him. All the doors were closed. And then he came back in a rage and he shot several of his coworkers. But what you see here in the inquest is all of a sudden we're starting to see we start to change legislation based upon what happens. So you can see here marked in yellow, so not only is physical violence, but we also now have to look at psychological violence. So you can see moral outrage after an incident, we change the legislation, and there you have it. So you can see, that's the way it works everywhere. So when you're seeing all these incidents that happen around sexual violence in the workplace, Harry Weinstein and all of that kind of stuff, we're starting to see now legislation will start to change. We start to see maybe there have been deaths because of a domestic violence issue, and we're starting to see occupational health and safety laws change to look at domestic violence. So that's how it works. Laurie DuPont, just to give you another example about how it works. Remember, Laurie DuPont was a nurse, and she worked in Hotel du Hospital, was murdered by Daniel. He then killed himself, I should mention. And in her case, when she was killed, it was considered a domestic assault that went really, really bad. And you see, the inquest for her, they said, we now start to need to include domestic violence and abuse and harassment. So you can see, it's just another example. Incident, moral outrage, a change in legislation. That's how it's driven. So we should be a bit concerned when we see all the incidences in the paper now about one thing after another thing after another, because the politicians are listening to this, and they will legislate. And so we will all be in the position of having to have more safeguards in place to protect people. It's not going to go away. Some people say to me, well, isn't this just the sort of flavor of the month? It's not. It's not going to go away. This is seen now as a viable, a very substantial occupational health and safety issue that we all need to take some care to protect people from, especially in some sectors. In Saskatchewan, in 2016, violence was the fifth ranking incident that happened on absenteeism at work. This fifth. I think there were 963 or 68 people who were off work because of incidents of violence in Saskatchewan. Now, you look at that number, and it doesn't really mean much, because how does it compare with all the other years? But you have to look at it, too, but what about sectors? You know, what about healthcare? What about retail? What about people who work in education? That's when you start to see the real risks in some industrial sectors. It's not just the big number. But 900 people still seems a mighty unacceptable number to me. And it's the same way right across the country, because we're collecting that information now. So there's this regulatory shift across the country. And what's happening is now legislation, as you look at the various occupational health and safety legislations, they're starting to now put it all together in a unified kind of way. And I'm a betting man, and I bet you that in 10 years, it's all going to look exactly the same. Violence will come from inside the workplace, outside the workplace. It will be physical, and it will be psychological at the same time. And it will include domestic assaults that happen in the workplace, that an employer needs to protect those people from their estranged spouse or a family member. So we're going to see all this start to happen in your time, maybe not in mine. Here is your definition, violence here in Saskatchewan, and I put it up here because you can see a lot of the same words here used in a lot of other legislation. An attempted, threatened, or actual conduct of a person that causes or is likely to cause injury. Now remember, injury is not just physical injury. It could be psychological injury at the same time. and includes any threatening statement or behavior that gives a worker reasonable cause. Now, word reasonable is real important. And it's in all legislation, and most of you probably know this, the principle of reasonableness, the concept, it's a legal concept. When you can't be really definitive, you just say it's a reasonable, with a reasonable person. So would it be reasonable for someone to be frightened by somebody who's slamming doors, throwing things in the office and stuff like that? Would that be reasonable? So that's the measure that they use. And this is very similar to everywhere else. They believe that the worker is at risk of injury. So yours, you can take a look at it. You can look physical, it could be psychological. It could come from inside the workplace, outside the workplace. It could come from any particular source. So now we have, all of a sudden now we're marching down that path, which is now going to be a little bit more confusing for us, because now we need to sort of decide what it is we're trying to measure in those particular cases. Now, so what this is a different kind of accident. Think of it, if you're an occupational health and safety specialist, this is an accident that's waiting to happen. And you know and I know, and this may sound kind of cynical, but advances in occupational health and safety, from my point of view, happen on the back of people who are injured or die on the job. And what happens is we don't put up a railing on those stairs until someone falls down. We don't give someone a respirator to get into an enclosed space until they suffocate. And we don't help people who are victims of violence at work until someone dies. And so that's what we're beginning to see. Incidences happen, and finally we're starting to do something. And it now we need to apply the same kind of rigor to this as we apply to everything else. And that's what's happening at this particular point in time, and I would applaud that. I think that's wonderful. Now, we also need to understand that this is a liability for any organization. The fines are now becoming astronomically high. Waterloo Regional Police in Ontario have a judgment, or not a judgment, but in court now, and the claim is for a case of harassment by a group of women who feel that they've been abused, $163 million. That's what they want. RCMP have a claim against them. That's the judgments already. They're on the hook for $100 million. In Edmonton, that you may have, some of you may be from Edmonton, you saw the federal prison there. The claim there, I think it says $43 million. That's what they're wanting. So the abuse is really becoming quite substantial. And when you look at these cases, what's happening is what they're doing is that not only is the employer responsible, but also managers can be held to account as well if they are a factor in this. And I'll talk about that in a second. So Walmart in Windsor, everything seems to happen in Windsor, but a Walmart in Windsor, $400,000. Because a manager was ruthlessly abusing an employee by ridiculing her in front of a whole bunch of other employees, by having her stack boxes or whatever it was, and he would ridicule her and ask if she could count and all of this kind of stuff. But they had that judgment. Bell Mobility was $500,000. So it's just going over and over and over again. And so we needn't think this is just a nice thing to do. It's something that could really sink an enterprise if it was really egregious at that particular point in time. So here we have all of the behaviors now that we're starting to see that need to be regulated, or need to be, at least we need to be careful about. And there is a lot. So we go from one side to physical assaults on the workplace, harm, physical harm. Most of us understand what that is. And I should also mention to any of you here, these slides you can have. They're not proprietary. If you need them, just call me. I'll send them out to you in a PDF format. And as you go down, because I see a lot of people taking pictures, I didn't want you to think that you had to take pictures of every one. I noticed that you're not taking pictures of me, you're taking pictures of the slide, which is really the issue. But now we're starting to move down from the physical assaults, and we're starting to talk about things such as harassment and bullying. Now, I ask you, and this is confusing for people, what's the difference between harassment and bullying? What is the difference? Nothing, really. They're pretty much the same. So we're starting to use different words now and starting to get even more confusing, but we're starting to see legislation start to attend to that. The word bullying is now finding its way into legislation, and then we're moving all the way down to the whole issue of incivility. Now, I get a little concerned when we get down there, because when does your bad day become an act of aggressiveness? When does my bad day? I've had bad days. Does that mean you're harassing just because you're chronically or, disrespectful for a week? I don't know. But the push is to go further and further and further and further south in terms of looking at that kind of behavior. And now people are afraid, should I be politically correct all the time? This is not an attempt to make people politically correct all of the time. We're going to mess up. But these are all the areas now that legislators are starting to look at and starting to sort of adjust things. And there are legislative protections for all of us. And here are some of them. These are just some of them, and they don't all work well together. So, for example, on the common law side, the liability that an employer has for the conduct of their employees. They do, vicarious liability. So if someone was to harm somebody and they had the whatever jacket on with the big logo and their company and they were maybe predatory and the employer didn't do anything, they could be held to account. We're starting to see these kind of judgments start to happen. So on the common law side, so employer is responsible for the conduct of their employees to an extent. And there are things there are three important things to keep in mind. Negligent hiring. If you hired somebody that you know was predatory or could be problematic, then, and you did nothing about that, but you knew it, but because they were a great commodity to hire, you put them in there, and they did something, you might be held to account for that. Negligent hiring. That's why so many organizations now are doing all the vetting. I'll give you a great example. We had a hotel, a large hospital that we conducted a threat assessment on a particular individual. He was a pharmacist. The hospital hired him, and what they did was he worked out well. He came to work every day. He seemed to be really quite conscientious. But they began to notice after the second week or so, he was wearing battle fatigues under his white coat. Okay, bad choice of clothing, but still, it doesn't mean anything. And then the third week, he used to carry a little metal briefcase with him all the time. And whenever you had a disagreement with him, he would pat the briefcase and say, "I'll be taking care of it all here." He had never let anyone know what's in the briefcase. He would just do that. When we did the assessment in terms of determining whether or not this man might be a threat to other people, we realized they had done no vetting of him, and there was a huge gap in his employment history, a huge gap, where we can only speculate where he may have been and what he was doing. But there's a great example of negligent hiring. Negligent retention, which just simply means that if you retain someone, and this is the big ticket item for many organizations now, if you have somebody in your midst who is predatory and dangerous, and you know, or you have reason to believe, or you should reasonably know that they are, and you do nothing and they harm somebody, what happens at that particular point in time is that you could be liable for that. So how many organizations have somebody, especially in the financial sector, where someone makes $1 bazillion for them? And they keep that person even though they're abusing everybody else. There is a certain point when there may be a liability trip for that. Third one, the sort of negligent supervision. If you have somebody in an organization who is a leader and who is all of a sudden being abusive and predatory in his own way, and we start to see this happening, take a look at Jian Ghomeshi, the CBC. Take a look at some of these cases, and you have somebody who's representing the organization and they are predatory, you could be held to account for that. Those three things. There's other laws which are wonderful too, labor laws that are out there. And we find now that a lot of people will leave their place of employment and will come back and talk about constructive dismissal because they were constructively dismissed because they were abused while they were on the job. And that's a possibility. And then my most favorite law, which is used by many nurses, is the intentional infliction of nervous shock. It's a great one. What it simply means is that if you can prove that somebody went about their business to create nervous shock in you, and nervous shock would be anxiety and depression, you may have a case. But you have to show intent, that they intended to do that. Ironically, a lot of nurses use this. I have no idea why, but it's been used. But you've got to prove that. But on common law, there's lots of things that you should be concerned about. And then there's also, I'll come to this a little second, there's the criminal code, which protects you and I anywhere we go. An assault is an assault is an assault. It doesn't matter whether it's in the workplace or outside. And a lot of people don't think that. They don't think of it. They think, oh, it's a workplace issue. And ironically, what happens is sometimes when you go to the police with an assault or an issue that is criminal harassment, which is stalking, the police will push it back to the workplace. So all of a sudden, you don't get any kind of redress from that either. I have a client of mine, a woman, and she was being stalked by somebody at her workplace. Her telephone wires were cut at her home. He was waiting outside all the time, and when we finally brought it to the police and said, this is criminal harassment, which is another word for stalking, is as we were leaving the police station, you could hear the desk sergeant say to the woman who was being targeted, "Boy, it must be nice to be popular." That's not what you want to hear from the people who are supposed to protect you. And I'm not suggesting all police are like that, but in some cases, it's difficult to know it's a criminal violation. Then we have legislation. We have the Occupiers Liability Act. Does anyone know what that is? People use this. The Occupiers Liability Act wasn't meant for this, but in the absence of legislation, people use it. It just simply means that if you own, lease, or otherwise control a facility, and you need to keep it safe, and if you don't, you could be held to account for that. So, for example, if you had an underground parking garage and a light was burnt out there, and people had come to you and said, "Listen, the light's burnt out. That's kind of unsafe going down in the garage." A woman goes down in there and is sexually assaulted. She could say, "You didn't maintain the facility, and I was therefore injured." Now, was the Occupiers Liability Act meant for that? No, but people will use it for that reason. Human Rights Code. I'm going to get to this one here in a second because that's the big daddy. The Human Rights Code, as you all know, is there for all of us, both at work and outside. You cannot be discriminated or treated differently on the basis of protected grounds, race, creed, color, and the like. And so people will come forward and say, "I am being abused because of my race, because of my faith, because of my gender, because of my gender identification," all of these things. So people are using those. But the big ticket item here is this, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. This is where the violence legislation rests, because it's seen as being an occupational risk, a health risk. And so that's where it sits. That's where governments have decided to put it. I think it makes some sense there. And when you look at the various Occupational Health and Safety Acts, they're slightly different from one to the other, but they're all starting to become the same. So these are the pieces of legislation out there to protect you. Now, they don't all work well together. Let me give you an example. We have a client who is a federally regulated employer, a relatively small workplace. They have valuables in the workplace, and as a result of that, they have armed guards at various places. And a woman turned to another woman and said, "One day I'm going to get one of these guns, and I'm just going to blow Frank away." And Frank happens to be the manager. If you're named Frank in the room, don't be concerned. It's not you, I don't think. He's the manager, and so Frank heard this, and he was going to bring this woman in. Let's call her Sally. He's going to bring her in. She goes off on medical leave. Before she could even get to the office, she's gone on medical leave. So she's gone for a few months. So everyone's breathing easy, and then Sally comes back to work. She's seen as being fit to come back to work. And then, you know, as an employer, you can't get the details on this, but she's fit. Now, you have a whole group of people under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in the workplace saying, "I'm not working here. I have the right to refuse unsafe work. And I consider this unsafe work because here's a woman who made a threat. She has access to weapons, and I suspect she probably has a psychiatric problem of some sort. And I'm not coming to work." You have 25 people doing that. And then we have a woman coming back, Sally, who's saying, "That's true. I do have a psychiatric problem. But that's protected under the Human Rights Code. So you need to accommodate me." And they can't. What do you do? If you're an employer, it's simply, you just get to choose who's going to sue you. You don't get to avoid it. But you see, this is how it doesn't work well together. I'm just curious. On a show of hands, would you err? I'll tell you what I did. Would you err on the side of the group, or would you err on the side of the individual? For the group, how many of you said? Okay. How about for the individual? Well, okay. What happened was the employer ended up firing her, paying her gobs of cash to go away, and they erred on the side of the group. Unless we were able to do a risk assessment that was really kind of definitive, I would err on the side of a group of people as opposed to an individual's rights. But that's just my own opinion, and I could be held to account for that in court as well. So because of all these things that are happening, we need to have a program that's put together that is portable, that we can articulate in a minute where we're asked to, and these are the components. And you likely have many of these components already in place. But my hope would be that you leave with a little bit more information on these, or it reaffirms what you've already got. So the way it happens is this, and depending on the size of your organization, I always suggest that people have some kind of committee, or at least one or two people who are in charge of the violence prevention program. That's critically important, because you can't work this just off someone's desk. They have to be given responsibility for it. There are many organizations. The larger the organization, the more important it is to have a coordinated oversight about this particular issue in the workplace. There are terms of reference out there. If you are interested in getting terms of references that other people have used for this kind of committee or oversight committee, send me an email. I'll send them out to you because that's important. Don't reinvent the wheel. We don't need to reinvent the wheel for that. So from the beginning, have somebody in charge, and it shouldn't just be somebody who has more time. It should be somebody who has the ability to do that. And if you're an employer, I always say, especially if you're a large employer, give them the time to do it. Because if they're working their day job and they're going to have to work this off the corner of their desk, probably this is going to get dropped on the floor, and they're not going to do it. So, policy, legislatively, how many of you here have policies in place? I suspect most people do. If you don't, look. If you don't know, your policy, sure, at the very least, should have particular elements in it. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. A hazard assessment or a risk assessment. This is, in some circumstances, required by law, legislation. You should be conducting some form of evaluation as to where the risks are in your organization on a regular basis. We'll talk about that in a very brief minute. Prevention measures. You should have prevention measures in place based upon whatever your assessment is. That's critically important, and they should be reviewed every year, I think every year, or after a significant event that happens in your workplace. This is what I'm going to spend more time on right after this large macro issue. I'm going to drill down to the threat, to the investigation, and what do people do? What do you look for? But you should also have a very, very tight reporting and investigation process. And I would strongly recommend, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that you have people who are trained to investigate, as opposed to somebody who just gets along with somebody and he's a nice person and let's just have him do it. So have an investigation, and if you have multiple investigators, most certainly have them trained by the same people so there's some consistency there. Emergency response planning, which everyone knows what to do if the fire alarm goes right now. You would all get up, we'd all file down to the muster area in the parking lot or wherever it is. But if someone came in here right now, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and dragged me out with a gun, I would hope there'd be a little bit more calamity, a little bit more concern. Some of you may say, he seemed like a nice guy. He was only 70. Others may say, great, lunch is early, we get off, you know. But the point is, we need to have a plan for that particular issue, not just for the organization, but for individuals. I'll talk about that in a second. Victim assistance, we're starting to notice now that there's litigation from victims who feel that they're never been served well. The organization walks away, the incident's over, and you forget them. And they don't have access to help. And then they're disabled from that particular point on. That's a big issue. So making sure you have qualified victim assistance, incident follow-up. Of course, if it's an occupational health and safety matter, you follow up in any incident that happens. And then, of course, training and education, which we'll talk about very briefly as well. And continual review, once a year or once every 3 years. These are the main components of a comprehensive violence prevention program, regardless of the jurisdiction in which you're in. Not all of these are legislatively required, but I think they're all necessary to have. Let me just pause for a second. Anything I've said so far that doesn't make any sense or anything at all? Wow, that's incredible. Good. Your policy. It sounds like many of you have policies here. You don't need to reinvent the wheel on policies. People have been writing policies for a long time now on violence and harassment and other abuses. I'm not suggesting that you should copy somebody else's because every organization is slightly different. But there should be certain pieces in your policy, and the policy should, in my view, be conspicuous. Everyone should see it. So in Ontario, let's say, it's required by legislation to be in a conspicuous place on the health and safety bulletin board so people can see it, as opposed to just simply electronically sending it out because there are people who will miss that. So it's required there. I'm not quite sure what happens here in Saskatchewan. Maybe that's the same way. But I strongly encourage you that the bare minimum, and if you are looking for templates of policies or looking at the clauses that are needed for policies, just send me an email. I'll send out some stuff to you. Again, and just look at it. You don't have to copy it, but just look at it. Make sure your policies have these same things in it. So, for example, it should have a statement. And the statement, the opening statement of your policy, that's the thing that's going to be read in court if you ever should get there. It's always ironic when we're called to court to testify as to whether an employee did something or didn't do something, or whether the employer was responsible or not. You can see the most horrendous neglect on the part of an employer. And then right when you start the case, they read out, "We are concerned about the health and well-being of our employees." But they didn't show it. So this is real important to live up to that. So the scope of your policy, who does it include? What are the behaviors that are clearly described in your policy? Whether it be sexual harassment, whether it be violence, whether it be other forms of abuse of power. These things should all be spelled out very clearly in terms of what it looks like in your policies and procedures. How do people report? How is it going to be adjudicated in terms of investigated? What about frivolous complaints? Is that in there? What does this not cover, meaning the policy? So, for example, just carrying out the business of being a manager is not harassment. And we see this all the time. People use the term harassment in a very loose way. People say, "You're harassing me, you're harassing me." When indeed, what's happening is the person's just being asked to do their job. They may not agree with that, but that's what they're having. So that needs to be in there as well. What recourse do they have? Do you have any kind of repeal process? These are all the pieces that should be in a very comprehensive policy. So I'd ask you to go back and look at your policies after today and see, is there anything in there that you're missing? Has it been updated in the last year? And policies should be updated on a regular basis. I would suggest they should be looked at least once a year, and they should be changed according to new legislation or according to any incident that may happen. So that's a big piece, the policy, which is the anchor for all of the work that comes after that. The hazard or risk assessment. Now, we're going to talk about hazard or risk in terms of individuals in a minute, but on the organizational side, what we have is an organization has a responsibility to take a look to see whether or not there are any vulnerabilities where you are. A hazard assessment is something whereby, and it should be conducted on a regular basis, if an incident happens, that should be part of your hazard assessment. So you should be going around looking for vulnerabilities. So for example, working alone, working with cash, working with highly volatile individuals, working in remote areas. If you do home visits as part of your particular organization, what about that? Are people protected there? Is there a risk there that you need to look at? You remember that horrific thing that happened in, I think it was in Virginia, where an on-camera woman, she was doing some in news, and her cameramen were there. She was by herself with him, and a man came in and murdered her right on TV. The whole issue then became an issue for us in terms of what about people who are in the community filming or working in the community? What kind of safeguards are there? So these are all vulnerabilities that may be there. Even if they're not something that's happened, they're still vulnerabilities. So those are all the risk assessments. People will look at risk assessments in terms of foliage around their parking lots. Are there hiding spaces for people? And this sounds like I'm being paranoid, but these are things that all you want is to happen once. Are there enclosed spaces in your building? What about closing up the building at night? Does someone do a sweep? How does that work? What about your sign-in procedures? What about people wearing a badge? All of these kinds of things are things that would go into a risk assessment. I have a very comprehensive list by category of things that people look at. It may be excessive for any one organization, but again, if you're interested, I can send that out in a PDF for you. Take a look through it and say, okay, this might be work, and maybe we haven't even thought of this. These are the important things. So looking at design and work processes is what you want to look at. Now, it sounds like we're just, I said earlier that we don't have people with Uzis in every street corner. It sounds like I'm thinking that way, but I'm just thinking prevention at this particular point in time. So the nature of risk, you think about it in two ways. And what we've just talked about is the organizational risk, the risk to the enterprise. But you also need to think about the individual risk, the individual who is of some concern. Now, we're going to get to this in a few minutes. This is a really granular area. And this is an area in some provinces which is becoming a huge issue. If someone does go rogue, did you know? What could you have done? Did you have an IME, an independent medical for that person? Did you caution them? What did you do? So this is becoming a huge issue. In Ontario, it is particularly a huge issue because in our Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's a clause in there that says if you are aware that somebody has a history of violence and they will come in contact with your employees, then you need to tell those employees. That works fine if that person's on the outside of the organization, like, don't serve Frank or whoever it may be. But if that person's in the organization, what are you going to tell everybody else? That this person has done time because of violence? See, they're not prescriptive. But it's important to think about the individual risk, and most people don't. But at the very least, doing an organizational risk assessment for the enterprise and for the various areas of your workplace. Developing prevention measures. Once you understand what your risks are, what are you going to do about them? Are you going to have, and there is working alone legislation across the country, are you going to have plexiglass at the reception? Are you going to have, special parking spots up front in your building for people who may have domestic disputes so they can park there easily, so they're not walking across the parking lot? All of these things have to be put into play at that particular point. So keep in mind, whatever risk you see, you have to address. That's the problem, writing it down. You have to do something with it at that particular point in time. So these are all the things that you need to do. And there's maybe a whole list of these things that you could do, and they may be, certainly be things that are easy to do. I would encourage you, if you possibly can, to do the risk assessment if you are unionized, to do it with your elected representatives, to do it with your health and safety committee. So just don't have someone doing it themselves. It's important that everyone does it. We do a lot of work in healthcare. So what we do is the audits in healthcare in the hospital. We want to know whether or not there's any carding on doors. So if someone's violent, will they know that that card means you've got to talk to the nurse before you go into that room? Because that person may be dangerous. And we recently did an audit, and I said, do you know what that card means, that red card? And they said, no idea. So these things have to work. So you have to do things that are communicated to the rest of the employees. Now, reporting and investigation. Really important. If you're a large organization, it's important if you have multiple investigators, whoever they are, I would strongly encourage you to have them trained by the same organization. And because there's consistency in how they go about the various investigations. I would also encourage you to have these folks trained about how you're archiving and writing your reports, because you want consistency across the board. You want to ask questions such as, how long do you archive your information? Where is the information? What about issues around confidentiality? Do you have those things in place? All of these questions, and there are a million of these questions out there to be able to ask, which are around on the whole issue of the investigation side. On the investigation side, which we'll talk about in a minute, what if you do have somebody who you're concerned about? Do you have a protocol for that? Do you have a process where you can have an independent medical done? Can you work investigations cooperatively with the union? And I don't know if anyone's here. Is anyone here from Unifor? Anyone here from Unifor? No? Well, Unifor, in some parts of Unifor, which is the large, it used to be CAW and CEP, come together, they actually do joint investigations in some sectors of Unifor, not all across the line. And there are some people who have really good experience with that. If you're interested in being in touch with them, let me know, because I know the person in Unifor who is really a champion on that. And you may be able to learn something about how unions and management can work together to be able to do these kind of investigations. But make sure they are consistent. People will complain about the investigation in two ways. They'll say, I didn't like the result, which is someone's not going to like the result. And the second thing is that it was done poorly. And you don't want to be brought before an adjudicator because it's done poorly. Do it well, and make sure your reports are consistent. Emergency response planning, as we said, everyone has a major emergency response protocol for your organization. However, if you have employees who work in particularly vulnerable places, maybe they work alone, and maybe they're a guard in a booth in a parking lot by themselves during the day, or maybe they're handling cash, or maybe they're doing work with respects to, regulating or denying people benefits in the community. These are always the big risk areas. Make sure that they have a plan for themselves. So, for example, in one community college, they realized that their receptionists were always being sort of treated terribly by the parents of students who came in and didn't think their kids got a high enough mark. And they were being abused. And what they did was a very simple thing. They realized that that was a risk. And what they do is that the receptionist, can just take their phone and put it off the hook. If it's off the hook for 15 seconds, security will be right there. And that's all they need to do. So these kinds of sort of safeguards, response plans for people who are in particularly vulnerable positions are very important to have. You may have them in your place. Think about it, because that also needs to be in place, not just the large enterprise-wise protections. Victim assistance. Hugely important. Unfortunately, what we see happening for many people is that they are victimized in some way. The organization and everyone around them goes, whew, got through that one. Thank God no one got hurt. And you forget the person who just was traumatized as a result of all this. If you don't have, and I'm sure most of you have, an employee assistance program of some sort, think about it. Think about it. If you don't, if it's not reasonable for you to have an employee assistance program, you could even negotiate with a provider in your community. But having somebody that could be there to support victims. Because we're now beginning to see victims starting to litigate because they weren't cared for, even if they'll come back years. We're also starting to see family members of victims who are now starting to litigate because you didn't do something to my son, my daughter, my wife, my husband, whoever it may be. So this issue of victim assistance is incredibly important. It does not mean that people are going to be off work for a long period of time, because I know that's the fear for many people, but it does mean that you're providing support. And remember, what you're doing is you're providing support to someone, and everyone else can see what you're doing for that victim. And I can't tell you how important that is. If people around that victim see that you've done nothing for that person, even if it means just following up, providing them a taxi chit home, giving them some time off, whatever it may be, people watch that. And you will be sort of injecting some goodwill amongst other places. For example, individuals who die on the job. It could be for any reason. It doesn't have to be from violence. The first thing that people complain about, we found, is how quickly the flag goes down to half-mast. How quickly. And people say, if that doesn't go down that fast, you don't care. So people look to see what you do as an organization, and they will sort of decide whether you're a caring organization or not. So make sure your victims are well cared for. Incident follow-up doesn't have to be complicated. What did we do? How did we do it? Should we have done more? Could we have done less? Was it effective? It doesn't mean blaming people. It just means to say, look at the incident. And again, this is where that committee comes in handy, because that committee can be the people who then go through and say, okay, how do we do? And you may change your risk assessment based on what you've done before. You may change. So this is a moving document. You're always changing this over time. And it's important that that all be documented at the same time. Training and education, hugely important. The days of the lunch and learn on violence prevention, I think, are over at this point. And that arbitrators and courts now are looking for the transfer of knowledge. The transfer of knowledge is simply, did the person learn anything in the session that you gave them? So, for example, if this was a session providing training for you on risk assessment or whatever, did you learn anything? And there would be a quiz at the end. There's no quiz, but there would be a quiz at the end. So a lot of people are turning to online programs or platforms. That may be worthwhile, especially if you have employees out in various geographically remote areas. So everyone's getting something consistent. And arbitrators are actually starting to look and see, how long did they stay on that page? Did they pass the first time around? Is there anyone delinquent? So you have to have an audit trail. So it's critically important, even if you do a live presentation for people, to have an audit trail, because that's going to be very, very important. What about new hires? What about students? What about contractors? What about any of this? These are all the important pieces that you need. And there are some basic things that you need in the training program, and these are some of them. Just rights and responsibilities, in terms of what's the responsibility of management, what's the responsibility of union, human resources, what are we looking at with respects to the prevention policy, making sure people understand it, making sure people understand where they need to go in terms of launching a complaint, and making it legitimate and acceptable to do that. And most importantly, looking at behaviors that they should be concerned about. That's critically important at the same time. So, and then at the end of all this, it's the program review. Every time, every year, every 3 years, whatever your legislation may suggest, is review it all. Don't go through, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but just go through, do we have this in place? Do we have this in place? Are there any upgrades and training we need to do? How many incidents have we had for the last year? Did we audit those to make sure we did a good job? All of these things can be handled by the committee or by the group of people who are responsible for this, including your occupational health and safety group or committee. That is a comprehensive program. Now, we could spend days just talking about each one of those elements, but I just want to make sure that you understand. So the reason for giving it in this kind of way is that sometimes ministerial investigators will come in, or inspectors will come in and say, show me your prevention program. And people run around trying to figure out, where's the policy, where's this, how do we do investigations? If you have it in one place, and you probably have all these components, you can at least articulate in an intelligent way. rather than making it up because you've been asked to do that. And so we ask people to have all of this ready for an investigator when they need it, if they should have it. Any questions at all about anything? Please, yes. Well, I'll repeat just for the sake of other people. So, yeah.
For the program review, can you include all of the employees? So, like our company does a big orientation day every year to orientate everyone for the construction industry for the new season. So we're doing it actually next week. So is that something like we've had a program in place for years?
Yeah.
It's been in there for 9 years, and it's been 20 years before that.
Yeah.
But I do some of the updates and everything. So can I review everything with everyone at orientation day and say, what am I missing?
Absolutely. Did everyone hear that, by the way? Did everyone hear at the back? She said it was a wonderful presentation so far. It's going really well. But yes, yes, you can. Yes, you can. And if you have a vehicle to do that, there's no right or wrong. You want to get as much input as you possibly can. How is it working? Make sure you have a scribe and make sure you take all that information down. And follow up on it, most importantly. I think when it, yeah.
I had a question about the victim assistance piece.
Yes.
My organization has the employee program.
Yeah.
But when we're investigating incidents, it doesn't always, like, how important is that documentation that service has been offered? Sometimes the employee doesn't take it up. They're like, yeah, I'm good, I'm fine.
Yep.
But it's important that we document that manager offered the assistance and encouraged it.
Yes. The question is how important is it? Because sometimes employees who may be victimized may not want to go there. And there's lots of people who don't want to use an employee assistance program connected to the workplace because they feel it's going to be unconfidential. So document it. Just document the request that you offered this and make it, don't make it time limited. Say, we want you to get some help if need be. I would also, if there's an attending manager, also to be vigilant about that person to make sure that, because sometimes people don't know they don't know, and they won't get any help. So I would follow up in terms of 2 weeks after, 3 weeks after, saying, just wanted to let you know that's still available to you. If you wish, document that. So I would always follow up and always document what you've offered, even though they haven't used it. Yeah. Was there another question that I think I saw around? No? Okay. Now, let's dig a little deeper. So you know what the components are that you need, and I should also mention there's a booth out here, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. They have a workplace violence prevention guide. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's a wonderful guide. It's a small little guide. I think it costs $12. Has all of the various components that you would normally use. All these things that I just talked about are there. Now, I'm not suggesting you all run out to the booth. I'm not getting a cut. But if you want, email me. I'll send you a complimentary copy so you can have it. But don't email me saying I want 25 copies. I'll send you one copy. So if you could do that, just email me. I'll send you a copy. It's not in PDF form. I'll just send it out. And if you want more of those copies, you can always see them. But it will give you a sample of what to do in each one of these things. I don't want you to leave here just with these elements without digging down to know what exactly would be beneficial. Okay? Now, the individual risk. This is where it gets really interesting. Remember, we looked at organizational risks in terms of work processes in the facility in terms of how safe it might be. But now we're looking at the whole issue of individual risk. Is someone going to be risky? Now, here's something that was written on a bulletin board in an office. Well, it was an office setting that were going through some labor problems. And this was on the board in the occupational health and safety part of the board. And what it says is every normal man must be tempted at times to spit on his hands, hoist the black flag, and begin slitting throats. Not something you want to see on a board. Of course, this caused huge concerns. And quite often you'll see people will write things that seem menacing, or people who do graffiti on walls. I can't tell you how many times we've been called to an organization where there is, the stalking song? I think it's Sting who does, every move you make, that's about stalking. It's about, and people take the lyrics and they write it on walls, and it sounds like someone's going to do some serious damage. But this was on the occupational health and safety wall. They were going through some very bad times, and we were asked to sort of follow up on this. Now, this is where it's more luck than anything else. And so whenever you get anything like this, should you ever have anything written like this, it's lyrical. Go to Mr. Google. Just take it and put it into Google. It sounds awfully silly, but it'll tell you where that comes from. And in this case, we did that. So we took it, put it into Google, and what we have is it's written in a book by this guy named H.L. Mencken way back in the 1800s. He was an early sort of labor activist back then. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us the individual who wrote this obviously reads. And he's obviously, or she, may be obviously very sort of involved in the labor movement. So all of a sudden you get another idea. And the interesting part, because we do this as a group, is that people who write these kinds of things on the wall tend to spend a lot of time online. And online, they may be things, has anyone heard or familiar with Second Life? Is anyone familiar with Second Life? So Second Life, for those of you who aren't, is a virtual place where you can go online and you can create a new identity. So if you were in real life, if you're kind of a meek and mild kind of person, your avatar, meaning your handle for this on-life world you're in, all of a sudden it would be Big Bob or Kick-Ass Bob or something like that. They're always something that they're not. But people who do this kind of stuff tend to spend a lot of time online, and Second Life is a place that they may visit, may not. So what we did was we had it narrowed down to 8 people who could have written this and put it on the board. 8 people. What we did at that particular point in time is that we wanted to know which of these 8 people spent a lot of time online, and we did have someone implanted into the workplace to sort of find that out. So we find out that 4 of them spent a lot of time online. In fact, some of them got disciplined because they spent time online at work. And then we wanted to find anyone who has an avatar. An avatar could be Second Life or anywhere else they may play in kinds of games. And so obviously our person went down, and we now narrowed it down that there are 2 who have avatars. And then we sort of pressed them to determine what the avatars were, or find out more, and one of the avatars was Mencken. So all of a sudden, it's not a coincidence that that must be the person. You bring them in, you have a discussion with them to determine whether or not they were the ones who wrote it. You cannot lie as a non-police officer, you can't lie, but you can say things like you know, but you don't. So what we would say is there any reason why your fingerprints would be on that piece of paper that was stuck on the bulletin board? Would there be any reason for that? And right away, hand up, I did it. Wasn't. But that person wasn't dangerous. But what it was is that look all the time that it spent to try to figure out who it was. He was disciplined, never was terminated, but he's still there. But he wasn't. So the question is, how do you know whether or not someone's going to be sort of based upon what they say or what they do? What looks like a menacing situation may not. And so what we have now is a lot of people who overreach and will look at somebody and will say, they're going to be dangerous. There's something wrong with them. I don't trust it. My spidey sense is working overtime on this. And then we have some people who underreach, and they don't do something when logic would prevail and say, you should do something about this. So not long back in Vancouver, we got a call from an HR professional in Vancouver. And what was happening there, it was on a Friday afternoon, because remember I took the call, and she said, I think we might have a case of workplace violence here. I'm not quite sure. You could tell me. And she said, well, someone's gone around the office, it was an office setting, and put a bullet on certain people's desks. Okay, well, and under the notes, under the bullet, was a little note that said, this one's for you. Now, I think that's shocking. I think it's shocking that would happen. What I find more shocking as an HR professional would say, is that workplace violence? That's the shocking part. You hang up, call the police, don't touch anything because it has prints on it. Don't touch anything. So we have people who don't reach far enough when there is a menacing act. Now this was kind of harmless, but nonetheless. There was even a T-shirt we found with this phrase on it that you could buy online. So it's all over that this is not a serious attempt to sort of frighten people to the point that they were going to fear for their lives. But violence is an interaction. It's an interaction between several things. That an individual, the individual who's the perpetrator, will quite often think that they have been rebuffed at every opportunity. They have a grievance, and they have begun to ruminate about their grievance over a period of time. And all the doors have been closed for them. And what happens is violence becomes a viable outlet for them. Now, thank God, none of us get there. But for some people, that's the case. They think this is the only way. Now, I can guarantee you, everyone in this room, including myself, if you pushed us long and hard, we would push back. We may not get violent, but we would push back. We might be obstinate. We might be passive-aggressive. We might do all those things. but it doesn't mean to say we're going to be violent. But you can see there are certain things that happen, but it is a dynamic that happens, and it's contextual. So it's what's happening for that person at that particular time, and that could change tomorrow or the next week. So it's not static by any stretch of the imagination. The current thinking about risk assessments, remember that's that one component on the investigation and the assessment part, which a lot of employers don't look at, which we think is important to do, is that it's profiling people is not necessarily, demographically profiling is not necessarily reliable. In fact, it could be extremely upsetting and certainly derogatory for certain groups of people. It's the behavioral markers that you look for. What are they doing? What are they saying? What do they look like? All of these things, and as long as you had an ability to be able to look carefully to see what they're doing, that's the way you look at this. It's not they fit a mold. It's not as if you're profiling somebody. Profiling is not a science, in my view. It's an art. And you may be lucky and you may not be. One-time assessments often don't work, meaning I assessed him 6 years ago. He was fine back then. Because it's dynamic. It changes over time. Maybe his spouse has left him. Maybe he's had some financial problems. Maybe he has health issues, whatever it may be. But the most important part, each incident is different. And we think that you shouldn't turn a blind eye if there's something really bothering you on that. And that's where that measure you have or you have access to will come into some handy. So the employer, the balance here is to balance the rights of the victims or potential victims and the right of the person who's under suspicion or you're concerned about. Now this plays out clearly when you have a domestic dispute in a workplace where both people work in a workplace. So you have the husband and wife there, and let's say, and I always say this up front, I'm always going to talk about a victim in domestic violence as being a female. I only do that because it's easy for me, and it's most often the case, male being the perpetrator. I don't mean, there's all kinds of permutations around this, and I recognize that. But if you have a woman coming to you in the middle saying, I'm afraid of my husband, he may hurt me because we're going to be separating, or I'm going to tell him, it's only an allegation. He works there. What are you going to do? He has rights too. So the balancing act here is really delicate and really should be, carefully considered. So that's the risk, and that's the task for an employer, what they're going to do. To move, to be conscious about what their concerns are, but to be able to be, really, careful about what kind of determinations you need to make. Now, the anatomy of anger, people often say that people become very violent because they're nuts. That's not the case. People with psychiatric disorders are often the victims of violence. And I hear this a lot. Psychiatric disorder doesn't mean to say you're going to be violent. In fact, most people with a disorder of some sort, they're victims. And you may have some disorders that may lend itself to aggressiveness, like dementia, or some personality disorders. But, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form, nor should we ever, that anyone with a mental health disorder or mental health diagnosis is going to be violent. In fact, everyone in this room, including myself, at some point probably could be diagnosable at some point in our lives in terms of depression and anxiety. That happens. And people may be violent because they're goal-directed. They want to steal something. They want to get something. They want a sort of retribution against somebody who's wronged them in some way. But one of the fundamental things, and this is the thing I want to leave you with on the risk assessment side, is this notion of perceived personal control. This is incredibly important. Just checking my time. It's incredibly important. And I want to talk a little bit more about this, and it relates to that PDF document that was sent to you, hopefully by the organizers. Now, perceived personal control, when I use the term control, and I maybe should use a different word, but I'm not talking about something like taking from somebody else, and disadvantaging them in some particular way. I'm talking about having a grip. We all like to have a grip, and we're all different in some particular way, but we're talking about, knowing you can do something to affect change in your life at that moment. The best way to think about it is this. Have you ever gone to your office or your workplace, whether it's home or work or wherever it may be, and you're overwhelmed anyways because work has been incredibly demanding, and you look at your desk and it's piled with papers and crap, and it's just a mess. And that makes you even more overwhelmed. And you get some kind of primitive relief out of stacking the paper. You just stack the paper. It looks organized, but it's not. You're just stacking it so it looks nice. That's what I'm talking about in having control. Knowing you can do something. Have you ever come in on a Monday morning and you see all these emails that people have been leaving you over the weekend that are ridiculous? They blind copied you on it. and you get some primitive relief by pressing the delete all button. That's what I mean. That's what I mean. It's just having that kind of relief. It's not a sophisticated thing. Psychologists refer to it as the locus of control. Is control with you, or is it outside you? This is an incredibly, from my point of view, an incredibly important psychological construct when we look at risk. And there are some things that you and I can do to be able to sort of screen for it. Just screen, just to see. It's not a predictor, but just to screen for it. So this is how it works. There are some of us here who need a lot of control. There's nothing wrong with that. My wife's like that. If you go to someone, visit somebody, and you go to their kitchen, this is the first diagnostic thing you should do, and if you see all their fridge magnets in a row, especially if they're color-coded, you know you're in the presence of someone who needs some control. And there's nothing wrong with that. And they have big day timers, and they have now all the sticking things around their monitors telling them where they should be and what they should do. There's no one like that here because they couldn't figure out what room to be in. But the point is, that's high on the end. And then you have people at the low end of control who don't need much. They wing it. They're cavalier. If they have a job tomorrow, that's great. If they don't, well, they'll land on their feet somehow. If you live someone with like this, they never pay the Visa bill on time. You get dinged with the interest. Their clothes never hit the dirty clothes hamper. I only know this because this is what my wife tells me. But the point is, they're cavalier. They don't need as much control as you and I. So there's a range. Now, everyone in this room, including myself, are somewhere in that range. And this is how it looks. Now remember, we're talking about the issue of threat and concern around control. So here we are. High locus of control, people who need a lot. Low locus of control, people who don't need very much. And we're all in there somewhere. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that we need control of our circumstances 80% of the time. Now, I'm making that up. But let's just say 80% of the time we need to be in the driver's seat of our life. And the other 20% we can default to, it rains on a picnic day, the car breaks down, the dog runs away, or something like that. It's things that we can't control. But 80% we need to be there because that's where we're comfortable. So we want to be above our threshold, every one of us. But if you're like me and like everybody else in the world, you have a bad day, you have a bad week, you have a bad month, maybe even longer. And you dip below there, and you have transitory anxiety, some sleeplessness, some irritability. You start treating people differently than you normally do. Like you start arguing with your neighbor who's a nun, stuff like that. But the point is, you're not yourself. And then all of a sudden, but things get better. Either you do something to make it better, or else you just lucked out. Things got better. So you go above your threshold again, and you're feeling good. But what we're starting to notice now, more than ever, is a lot of people slipping below their threshold. And they're not deep diving to the point of being vegetative and very depressed, but they're just below it. And there's actually, if there's any mental health people or any medical folks in the room here today, or nurses or anyone like that, you'll know about the DSM-5. The DSM-5? The DSM-5, for those of you who don't know, is a big cookbook of diagnoses that psychiatrists and medical practitioners use to diagnose people. And you don't have to be a physician to get one. You can go and buy one at a medical bookstore. And they're great to have. It's not a coffee table book, but it's a book where you can diagnose anybody. And it's very simple. You look and it says, if you do this, and this is the time frame you do it, and this is your premortal history in terms of your past. If so, here's your diagnosis. So you can actually diagnose everyone in your family for next Christmas. And now you know why Uncle Chuck is the way he is, because he's got a diagnosis. But there is a diagnosis in there called being dysthymic. Dysthymic. It's a great term. I can't spell it very well, but I can say it with great authority. Dysthymia is simply low-grade blahs. It's where the bloom is off the rose. You're tired most of the time. You're just, things that once brought you joy don't. Your interests seem to be waning. If you come to Toronto, you'll see a lot of it on the subway. You'll see a lot of it on the subway. On the subway, my hobby is listening to other people's conversations. And what I do is on the subway, you can hear two conversations. Well, you only hear one, because what happens is one half of the car on the subway are complaining about the idiot boss, the job that's not going anywhere, didn't sleep last night, the kids are a mess, it's just blah, 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 blah. The other half of the car are sleeping because they're sleep deprived. And that's why we have all the advertisers trying to sell us new mattresses and new pillows, because none of us are sleeping very well. So there's a whole bunch of people below there in this dysthymic kind of state. And I'm not diagnosing everybody, but the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychological Association a number of years ago, and I think it's actually worse now, were suggesting that almost 50% of the Canadian population were walking around in this blue funk 2 or 3 times a week. Now just think of that. If that's true, that means half of us are not ourselves. We slip below that threshold of having much control. That's the concern. In fact, it has gotten so bad in some areas, in some urban centers such as Toronto, that people are looking at people who are happy as being strange because they're not like the rest of us. And we actually recently got a call to come to a particular workplace because there was somebody who all of a sudden their behavior turned, and they were a curmudgeon and they were a very negative person, and all of a sudden they became incredibly happy over the weekend. And they were happy for a month, and people thought, for sure they're off their medication. We're sure there's something wrong with them, because we've all been taught when you see changes of behaviors that are dramatic, you do something about it. And so they called me and said, would you come and see this man, because we think, he's dangerous, because he's happy. When I went to see him, I said, listen, it's embarrassing, but other people are concerned about you because your behavior's changed. You're excessively happy now, which seems, that's great. Any explanation? He had worked out his retirement numbers and realized he could retire earlier than he expected, and he had more money than he ever thought. So my suggestion to him wasn't professional. I said, just tell him all where to go. But the point is simply this, is that if you have a lot of people below here, it looks normal. But down here is where, this is the breeding ground where people get aggressive. This is where people get aggressive. Now, that doesn't mean just because we're in a blue funk we're going to be aggressive, but we're not the kindest down there. None of us are. And what you see down there, if you look at the literature, is you'll see people start to look at injustice. Injustice, the issue of justice. It's not fair what's happening to me. And they may not have a target for that, but it's just not fair. And there's 2 kinds of injustices that they talk about. One is distributive injustice. Distributive injustice is simply meaning I don't get paid enough. And that's rarely something that's going to provoke someone into anger to hurt somebody. But the next one is the one that's a little bit more insidious. It's called procedural injustice. It's when people start to think that somehow the rules are applied to them differently than it's applied to other people. So it's not fair. So-and-so got this. I didn't. It's not fair because the insurance company won't give me the money I think I should get because of my action. It's not fair. And if I was to show you all the emails that come to our office in a particular day, that's one thing they always talk about. It's not fair. This is not fair. And if you go back and do a psychological postmortem, and all the people that, thank God there's been few of them, who have been that seriously disturbed that they would hurt somebody, you begin to think all of them have a history of not being understood and feeling that the rules are different for them. Now, that does not mean to say that if you have any thoughts that the rules are applying to other people more favorably than you, that you're going to be violent. That doesn't mean that. But it's a pool from which this stuff happens. You with me so far? So people feel, in fact, in some cases, people make a lifetime of it. And there's some research now that's rather convincing that's coming out of Germany, and it is, remember, post-traumatic stress disorder people used to talk about, or still do, but they're talking about post-traumatic embitterment disorder. Good Lord, we got another diagnosis. But when you look at it, have you ever met that person who is never happy? That person who isn't it a great day so far? But you're having these people who are just chronically ill, chronically negative. And so when you see these people, you think, geez, But it may be that they just have no control of their circumstance. Now, the issue of control, there's 4 areas. And I'm leading up to that form that you've got. Think of these as 4 legs of a stool. Now, when I ever meet anybody, I do a quick triage to find out how much control they have in these 4 quadrants. Whenever my daughter used to bring people home, she was dating, I'd always go through this. She never brought them home anymore. But the point is, you just start to ask questions about each one of these areas. Think of these as 4 legs of a stool. 4 legs of a stool, meaning if you have all 4 of these things going for you, and you have control and things are going well on each one of these sectors, you're doing better than the vast majority of people. In fact, you're doing better than me. Usually, something's not going well. Work's crap, or things are not going well outside, or you're not feeling very well, but there's always something wrong. So 3, you're doing fine. 2, you start to teeter. 1, you got a problem. So, for example, if somebody is what they do, they only identify themselves as being, that whatever that manager position is or whatever it is. If you start to tinker with them, it's a little bit more serious than if the rest of their life was going well. It's just logic. So these are the 4 areas that you need to have a sense of control in. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about what they are. Work. Everyone needs to have some sense of control at work as much as they possibly can. What you do, how you do it, when you do it, should you do it, how to get out of doing it, all that kind of stuff are the important things. You spend 80% of your time there, and you know and I know that when that's not going well, geez, life is not good. Life is hard. So we need to look at that, how much control they have in the workplace. Second to that, how much control do they have in the avocation, meaning the stuff they don't do at work. So, for example, family, friends, activities, all of that kind of stuff. Whenever you see people interviewed who had done some heinous things, they always say he was isolated. He never got along with people. Well, there may be a reason for that. So anything that's happening in one's personal life, they could be serious things, like maybe there's a pending divorce, maybe there's some financial problems, maybe there's something going on. So all of those things, you sort of do a quick screen on. How much control do they have there? How much control do they have physically? This is important because we know that a lot of people who tend to be a little bit more aggressive, not all, but some, have a physical ailment of some sort. It doesn't have to be a big ticket item. It could be chronic headaches, digestive problems. It could be alcohol use and abuse. There could be a mental health issue going on at the same time, depression or anxiety or whatever it may be. So there's something going on, or they're using over-the-counter drugs in a way that may not be good for them. And a lot of people will do that and self-medicate by taking over-the-counter stuff, or at least from the counter, without thinking that that's going to sort of alter their personality too. So physical control is critically important. And interactional control means how are they feeling that people treat them and how do they treat other people? That's important for them. So when you sit and meet somebody, you can just have a casual conversation and ask them how work's going. You can ask them how, any ailments they have. These are 4 things that you sort of hone in on when you're starting to see whether or not someone has a lot of control or not. Remember, they don't have a lot of control. They're below their threshold. They will have some grievances, and they will think things aren't going their way. Doesn't mean to say that they're going to be aggressive. It just means that they're in a vulnerable position. If they're impulsive at the same time, that's a bit of a concern. So we're just doing a quick screen here. Now, if you want to know what it looks like and sounds like, it's this. This is Pierre Lebrun. Remember, Pierre Lebrun was the shooter at the OC Transpo bus terminal in April of 1999. And he left a note. It was tucked under his mattress where he was staying with his mother. And this, I'll read you the note. And this is what someone who has no control of their circumstances. Remember, in his case, he had been fired. Work was totally out of his control, and he was abused by other people while he was there. His family life, there was no family life. He was living with his mother, an adult, had very few friends, isolated. Physically, on the physical side, he was having, he had some very significant physical ailments. He was being treated for depression, we know that. And we know that he felt that other people were just targeting him. So he was weak on all those 4 areas. Here's the note he left after the shooting, and I'll read it to you. I'm going to commit an unforgivable act. I have no choice. I'm tired, exhausted, and completely backed against the wall. They will never leave me alone. I can't go on living like this. They have destroyed my life. Remember, he's finding the injustice of it all. I will destroy their life. OC Transpo and the unions can't hide from what they've done to me. They will pay dearly for what they've done to me. The people who I hold responsible are, he lists 4 names. He randomly shot. He never shot individuals, along with many others. All I wanted was for them to leave me alone, not to bug me, but it was too much for them to ask. And they have spread lies, especially that I am a rat who denounced my own union. Members, try and have them stop laughing at me. That's verbatim. Now that screams of somebody who has no control. He left that note as he went to the bus station. The tragedy is that, this was at a time when people didn't take these things seriously. And unfortunately, he had told somebody that he was going to do this. And they thought he was just being an idiot and that he's not going to do this. Unfortunately, he did. That gentleman, this happened in April, that gentleman killed himself in July because he couldn't take it anymore, the guilt that he knew that this was a possibility, he could have stopped this. Here's the note he left. I've been unable to sleep well since the shooting at OC. The gunman Pierre had talked to me at great length about it, and where to get a better shot at some managers. As it turned out, he shot himself in the same location in the loft. I feel guilty as hell for not telling anybody, and then he killed himself. The point being, and not to be dramatic about it, but the point being, we've come a long way since then. That, if you see telltale signs, that maybe we should take a look at these a little bit better. We should apply our policies and procedures in a more, rigorous way. And that we should enable people who work for us, if they have a concern, or if they're told something that causes them some worry, that they should say something. But they need to have somebody to tell that to. This is unusual. This doesn't happen a lot. But it is just the poster child of what can happen almost when things go really bad. Now, you have, I hope, I'd sent to the organizers that they would post anyone who came to this session a little tool. It's called PPS Screening Guide. Did everyone look at that? Did everyone get it? I just want to know. You did? Okay. Here's what I ask. If you didn't, I see some people had it, actually, so some people haven't. If you haven't gotten it, email me, I'll send you a copy. This is a screening tool based on the issue of control. This is not a predictor, and I'm providing it to you for education purposes, not to use it on other people, if I could ask you to do that, because it's gone a long way in terms of reliability and validity research that still needs to be done. But the reason we developed this was we began to notice that there were people in workplaces who were the first point of contact with individuals who were having a difficult time, and who people were worried about. Human resources, occupational health were the two major groups. And we found that they were making referrals that sometimes weren't appropriate. They were overreaching or underreaching, but they didn't know. They saw things, but they weren't quite sure whether or not there's something significant to be concerned about. So what we did over time was we went through the literature, picked out those major areas. Again, it's all predicated on this notion of control, how much control people have. And so the tool that you see, it gives you an explanation of how this information is gathered. It gives you some cautionary notes about how not to use the tool. But it's used as a screening guide, that when you see somebody, there are a list of questions or a list of areas that you could formulate your own questions to be able to tease out how much control they have at work, how much control they have in their families, how much control they have physically, and how much control they have interactionally with other people. Because if you have somebody who doesn't have any of this, doesn't mean to say they're going to be violent. It just means to say they're at greater risk of maybe a mental health issue. They may be at greater risk of being, more isolated than most. It could be any reason, but it doesn't mean to say they're going to be violent. I don't want you to suggest that. So the four areas that are in here are the work, family, physical, as well as interactional. Now, here are the work elements. If you have it, you can look at it as I go along, but if you don't, ask me and I'll send it to you and you can take a look at it. One was the whole work area, and there were a number of elements there that we felt were important to start asking people. You don't have to go through and ask people specifically and say, go through and ask them from the guide. You make it your own. Over time, use these questions, these areas of exploration. So mark job dissatisfaction. I don't mean that somebody is just complaining about their job once or twice, but chronic dissatisfaction, who constantly hates the job and feels totally abused and totally used and misunderstood at their particular work. That's critically important to make that distinction. So just because you had a bad day doesn't mean that. So you're looking at complaints and allegations and all these kinds of things. Performance concerns. An individual who has been sort of talked to because their performance is lagging, and the performance quite often may be a deficit because they treat people differently or badly. Yelling and screaming, doing things like that, where they've been reprimanded over a period of time. I know you're all sitting there thinking of somebody in your mind. If they're overwhelmed by work, this is different than being sort of complaining about work. But when you're overwhelmed to the point you can't get on top of it, it's just going to be never-ending. Can you imagine how that would feel? And some of us have actually been there on a chronic basis for a period of time. Chronic basis. Feared by other people in the workplace. Whether people worry about them. They don't want to work with them. They don't want to be around them. They're afraid of them. They voice some concern to HR, to occupational health, or to the union steward, or to their manager, but he frightens me. That's something that at least pay attention to. And the over-identification with work, meaning that they are their job. Have you ever seen anyone and you say, "Hi, my name's Glenn." Of course, you use your own name. And when they come back to you and what they say is, "Well, my name's John. I'm the manager of such and such." Well, I didn't ask you your job was, but they're identified so strongly with what they do. These people they may do really well while their job's doing good, but they don't do so well when that's at risk, and that's a problem. So think about those individuals where identification is just too much identification. They are what they do. Social elements. You'll see a series of areas there that you can inquire about in terms of, losses, imminent losses. And these could be things that could be significant, like the death of somebody, a separation or a divorce. It could be a child going away to school. It could be sort of an illness, someone's hospitalized. It could be, something that might be pending, or they're declaring bankruptcy or anything like that. Socially isolated, where they don't have a network. Now, some people do this by choice. They choose to be, really a loner, a misanthrope in some way. I'm not referring to those people, but someone who is isolated and doesn't have friends, who doesn't have anyone that they can go back and talk to, because we know that can be mitigating to have somebody to talk to about what's going on for you. So if you see people who are that isolated and they're loners, they're considered loners. Anyone who has antisocial behavior that you know about, and you may not know about that. Any protection orders that they might have had. Any brushes with the law around domestic disputes. Any sort of fights in the workplace. Any kind of, thefts, even though they may be petty. Things that may be charged, there may be no conviction. Are they on probation? Which doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be violent, but you want to see how antisocial might they have been at some point in their time. So you go through these very quickly. Again, these are worked into a conversation. They don't have to be asked point blank. Health concerns. Again, health concerns don't need to be major. I mean, yes, some of them could be that someone has, a debilitating illness that may be terminal, but it could be someone with chronic headaches that haven't been diagnosed or haven't been treated well. Backaches, aches and pains so they can't move around very effectively. Issues around alcohol use or abuse. Issues around, any kind of medications that they might be on. I met someone recently who was on Gravol, and people use Gravol to get to sleep sometimes. And he was using it every day, and that was a problem for him. He couldn't sleep without it at that point. Or people who are taking excessive amounts of headache tablets, and they don't want to really think about it. You can ask questions about that. But anything that would be debilitating, whether it be significant or not. And substance use, as I mentioned. Any kind, or polyuse as well, meaning multiple drugs at the same time that aren't being monitored. Very important. We notice that in some people. Interpersonal elements, which are certainly how you feel you've been treated. Do they appear to be entitled? Like, I should be getting the biggest salary in the place because I'm the best person here. Like Donald Trump, you see that every day, a sense of entitlement. Sort of a narcissism that is just them. And it may not necessarily be bragging, it just may be there. They just ooze that kind of sort of, it's me. Problem maintaining any kind of stability. They're impulsive. And they're always going to sort of, let's get a strike going, or let's start doing this, or let's grieve that, or whatever it may be. They're always being combative with somebody else at that particular point in time. If they're suspicious and fearful about what's your intent. I've actually had people come into my office, and what they'll do is before they sit down, they'll come and look under the table to make sure there's no listening devices, make sure that nothing's going on. People will ask that all the time, There's this overall suspicion of other people, their employer, or anybody else for that matter. The last one here is the one that I find most intriguing, and that is the victim or martyr, the person who says, all I'm doing is for the people who come behind me. It's for the young people. I'm going to stand up. Because once they start to see themselves as being, beyond, this is now for other people, then that's an issue because they have a goal. They have a place to be. They want to be remembered in some particular way. Now, all of these areas, in these 4 quadrants, and I'd ask you, go through it, just look at it, and just be aware of that. So when you see somebody, and this is, I think, very important, if you see somebody and that all these areas are just not lining up for them, doesn't mean this is not a diagnostic tool. This is just simply to suggest, does someone have a lot of control? And we know the issue of control does have a part to play on aggressiveness. That's all it means. So please, be very cautious with that. I don't want to use it in a negative way. Any question about that? There is a book that I'd recommend if you have children. In fact, if you have children who are daughters, it's called The Gift of Fear. The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. Gavin de Becker is an investigator in California, had the pleasure of working with him. And he wrote a book called The Gift of Fear. And what it is just simply trying to trust your spidey sense, your intuition. Because a lot of us will see something and it will make us feel a particular way, and we'll just brush it off and say, nah, it's nothing. Well, the book helps you to sort of get in touch with why are you fearful, to trust your intuition. So you can get that from Amazon, but it's a great book. I give it to my daughter and all my daughter's friends who are dating. I make sure they have copies of it so they can weed out the creeps are out there. Any question about this notion of control and the role it plays and how you may want to think about that? Okay. Yes, please.
Is it something that goes on for a long period of time, or is something where somebody snaps or somebody just gets?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. That's a good question. Does it go on for a long period of time, or does someone just snap? I would estimate that it goes on for a long period of time. This is not something that all of a sudden one day someone gets up and bang. Now, there may be a catalyst to their acting in a particular way, but it goes on for weeks, months, sometimes years, that somebody will slowly move up to this particular area. Absolutely. It's a very gradual, and I'll show you something here in a second just before we wrap up about how gradual that will be. But it's a gradual, sort of slow burn over a long period of time. When someone acts out of character and all of a sudden does something, it's usually because if you do a psychological postmortem on that, you probably find things that have been going on for a long time. And that's what people say. If you knew what these markers were, you'd prevent that. Well, these markers may not be really significant things. They may be small things that you can't really do anything about. So also, it's important to be very conscious of someone's immediate change in behavior. So if they turn from one person to another person in a split second and they're all of a sudden different, you may want to ask, hey, that would be a concern for me in some particular way. But that probably has been going on for some period of time. Now, the individual threat assessments, there are a number of threat assessment tools out there, and there's two forms of threat assessment tools that people use. Actuarial tools, where people give you a score, and then professional judgment tools. Most of these are professional judgment tools, with the exception of the Mosaic, which is a Gavin de Becker's tool. But, if you are in a situation and you are in an organization where you have someone who's of concern, the important thing is to either make sure that you have somebody that you can turn to who has a threat assessment ability. It may or may not be a physician. Physicians aren't necessarily trained for that. But you could ask for an independent medical. You could ask for some way of having it looked at in some way. These are some of the tools, and I'm not suggesting you use these tools, but these are some of the tools that are out there being used. Now, here's the gentleman at the back had the great question, does this happen right away? And generally, no. Generally, there's a grievance. Something has gone on, and they felt, remember, they want to blame somebody because it's unjust. That could be a long time ago. And all of a sudden, they start to ruminate about it, and they start to isolate themselves. They start to ruminate and think about it. Have you ever had that occasion when you've had an incident with somebody at work, and maybe you handle it in a way you didn't think you should have, and you're on vacation a month later, and you're still sitting there going, shit, I should have done this. I would do that. Well, that's ruminating. Well, these people just ruminate. I should do this, I should do that. And it becomes a way of life at that particular point in time, and then they start to plan. They start to plan to get back at somebody. And it may not be lethal. It could be, I'm going to put a hole in their tire. I'm going to make sure they don't get the best, shifts at work. I'm going to do something like that. And then they start thinking that way. Only in a very, very tiny few will think of it more sinister than that. And then they actually prepare, and then they act. But that happens over time. So the threat assessment ability is to be able, where do you get them? Where do you get them in here? Can we find that some indicators in here that we might be able to sort of intervene in some way? Now, the important thing is that people will sometimes look at somebody and they'll say, without a doubt, this person is actually dangerous. And it's far from the truth. And I meet many of them where they're about to be fired, and it's not them. It's not them. I'll give you a great example. We've had several of them in the last month like this. An individual was referred because he had a shouting match that became very, very loud and very sort of violent in language. And it was the disagreement he had was he was being cheated $1.50 on a lunch allowance. And he just exploded. And what happened, he was on the cusp of being fired. The assessment was going to happen. I got a chance to meet him. And they said, do you want police? I said, no, I don't. I can run. So I saw him. And, the customary thing is I write down, they tell me what happened in their way. I don't care. It could be the sky is red. I don't care. Just tell me what happened. I'll write it down, and I'll give it to you so that I make sure I get it right. And I'm going to tell them a story about themselves. They're going to tell me. I'm going to write it, and they'll have it. And so I have them read it. So I come back, and I have him read what I wrote. And he's sitting there. He's turning the pages. He goes, yeah, okay. He turns the pages. But if you work really hard at somebody, you realize there's some telltale leakage in their face. He wasn't reading the page. His eyes weren't tracking the lines. So if you look at someone, if you and I were reading, you would see our eyes would move. And they weren't. They were just in the middle of the page. He was perfect in his timing and would turn the page. And turn the page. And I asked him, did you see the part in there that I wrote about when you told me A, B, and C, which wasn't in the report? He said, yes, thanks for putting that in. So he wasn't reading it at all. And then to ask him, you have a hard time reading? And he said, yes. He was reading at a grade 5. His workplace became so computerized that he now had to read manuals. He had to pass tests. And he was so upset with himself because he couldn't do it. He was ashamed that people had ridiculed him his entire life. So here's a man had a disability that needed to be accommodated in the workplace. He didn't need to be fired because he was violent. And his episodes that he was having was just out of fear for other people. So, we have to be really, really careful in terms of who we label as being violent or not. And we need to take those things into consideration because what you look like may not necessarily be what you are. And this would happen for every single one of us. We are in our infancy in trying to understand this. We are just in our infancy to try to understand what are all the parameters that go into making someone aggressive and violent. This notion of control is one important piece, which I wanted to leave with you. Any questions? Please, yes.
Thanks for the presentation. I don't know what your time is. Would you be able to speak a little bit about the value and benefit of a code silver?
A code silver, yes. Oh, that. Are you? Yeah, there you go. Okay, now I understand. I guess, yeah, because we had this whole conversation of code silver. So code silver for you, those in the hospital, is when there's and correct me if I'm wrong on this because it's been a while since then. Is if there's an active shooter, if there's an incident of someone with a gun, what do you do in a hospital? And code silvers are not necessarily universally used in Canada with respect to hospitals. There are a lot of hospitals who are now looking to see the value of it. So what it means is simply having it's a plan of response should there be, because there's code this and code that. When you go into a hospital, you hear these various codes. Well, code silver would be, they usually have a place that's reserved for people to be sort of, hunkered down to make themselves safe. And these are becoming incredibly, people are looking at them very, very seriously. The importance to them is you've got to, we did an audit, and I think this is one of the things that you and I talked about maybe at that point, an audit of a hospital had a code silver. And in the audit, we asked them, so can you tell us where people would go if there was a code silver? And they just had a code silver. They didn't know where anyone would go. And I said, and what would happen to all the patients? What would happen to them? Would all the staff run and leave the patients? So all of these things need to be thought about in terms of code silver. But for those of you who are in hospitals here, the Ontario Hospital Association, that was something that they've talked about very seriously, about something that needs to be in place in hospitals. And it's much more complex than what I'm obviously telling you, but it's something, if you need information on that, then be glad to sort of send you information, because we had this kind of dialogue before about something that was very valuable. So these are the kind of things we need to think about. And the other thing in hospitals is, what about weapons? What about searches of patients? For a long time, people didn't want to search patients because they're our clients. Well, if someone's got a gun under the pillow, you want to know, especially if you're in an inner-city hospital. So there's so many things. What about charging psychiatric patients? Is that something you can do? That's a big issue in hospitals across the country as well. So there's all of these issues and new innovations that people are starting to look at, not because we have people with Uzis in every street corner, but we need to be prepared for that rare, unusual event that happens. Code Silver is one of them. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Please.
Do you find that there's more difficulty in the developing processes for the people, or is there, like I work at university where there's a lot of
Oh, yeah.
a lot of rooms. Is it preparing the facility or allowing,
Yep.
doors opening
Yeah, and that's all part and parcel of the risk assessment that you would do on the facility side. And in a university which has open boundaries, you can come and go. Anyone can come and go. There's no checking in. So a person would go about that using a very prescribed risk assessment protocol about what about locked doors? What about closing up at night? What about furniture that can be used for weapons? What about any of these things? Windows that do or do not open. All of those things. Corners, rather than having a mirror in a corner so you can see who's around the corner. All of those things need to be thought about. Now, those are budgetary issues that people don't want to spend money on. But, nonetheless, if you are in a university, may I ask which university you're in? There is an association called the Association for Threat Assessment Professionals, and they have a special interest group, universities. They have about 40 universities and colleges across the country who are all looking at the whole issue of risk assessment. And if you want, just email me. I'll give you their details, because it would be a wonderful thing if you were part of an academic, a post-secondary setting, to join the group, and you'll learn a great deal from other people who are having the same problems you are. That's the only way we get along, is to be able to share information. Anything before we have lunch? Listen, I want to thank you. I know 2 hours may be a long time for some of you to sit, but I hope my job is this. I hope you leave with more information than you had when you came in, for one. And if you knew all of this stuff, thank you for sitting through it, but also I hope it reaffirms some of the things you already knew. So thank you, and have a good remainder of the conference. Thank you. Thank you.
So Glenn, thank you very much for providing us this important information. We know, even from our stats, it's an emerging issue. It's likely an issue that's been there for a long time. We're just starting to really see it now. So thank you so much for helping us understand this issue a little better, and some takeaways in terms of things we might think about and do. So great information for us to take away. Once again, thank you to Mr. Glenn French for a great presentation. Just a reminder to fill out your evaluations, and lunch will be served right away in the Grand Salon. Oh, to the right. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you. Perfect.